Welcome to the Bazel Show, where we discuss Bazel and other enterprise-grade tools for building and testing software at scale. This podcast is brought to you by Flare.build, the world's first Bazel company and a member of the Bazel Community Experts Program. Over the last 3 years, Flare has onboarded thousands of engineers and migrated hundreds of millions of lines of code to Bazel. They also offer the world's fastest cache and CDN for Bazel, in addition to Bazel remote build workers and an industry-leading build and test analytics platform. And these offerings are available as a fully managed SaaS, co-managed on customer infrastructure or on-premises. To learn more about Flare's products, expert consulting and support services, and online interactive training, visit their website at flare.build or say hi via email to hello@flare.build. This podcast is returning to a more regular episode schedule after a long hiatus, and we have an excellent lineup of guests in the coming weeks, so keep an eye out for future episodes coming shortly. Without further delay, today's guests are Penn, a software engineer at Google Munich. He has been working in the Bazel team for 6 years after graduating from China. Yun initially worked on Bazel Windows support and helped build TensorFlow on Windows. Most of Yun's work has been open source focused, including improving the Bazel CI and packaging Bazel for Debian. He's the current TL of the Bazel open source subteam and one of the core contributors to Bzlmod. Xudong joined the Bazel team about 2 years ago and has been working on Bzlmod for the majority of the time. Now over to your hosts and Flare co-founders Tatiana and Zach.
Welcome back to the Bazel Show. So here we are again after a really long hiatus for a much overdue episode. And today we're going to talk about Bzlmod. I think this will be a very exciting topic, and looking forward to jumping into it. Of course, we're talking about Bzlmod, and this is the new module system coming to replace workspace files in Bazel. And I would definitely like to start things off with understanding what the motivation is, what was wrong with workspace files, and sort of how this new feature in Bazel came to be. So I'll hand it over maybe to Yun first to kick things off.
Yeah, sure. Hi, everyone. So basically, when we open source Bazel from Blaze is the internal Google build system, right? And internally, we're using a mono repo. And when we open source Bazel, we have to consider how to make one project depend on another. And that's when the workspace file was introduced. But it didn't consider the complexity when dealing with multiple transitive dependencies and how to resolve the dependencies. So the community grows and more projects depending on each other, and this workspace file getting more complicated. So first you have to declare all your transitive dependencies in one single file. That is not working well. And then people are coming up workarounds like loading macros from another project. And there's no actual dependency resolution. If one external repository is defined multiple times, it's very hard to figure out where it's defined, which project introduced it. So that has always been one of the major pain points for Bazel open source users. And we aim to improve that.
Yeah, to add a bit onto that, if we're familiar with any of the other popular package managers or language package managers such as Go's module system or Java's Maven or Rust's Cargo, they all have some sort of dependency declaration format that's more or less, declarative. Whereas Bazel's workspace file kind of grew very organically into this imperative format. So there's no bird's eye view of everything like, what do I want my direct dependencies and what do my dependencies want? It's all just instead of that, it's all just very linear. Okay, I want these, I will bring in these. And then if my other dependency wants something else, they'll just come in after. It's kind of a very chaotic, very organic growth of dependency management. On top of that, so that means that it's really hard to just figure out what you're using in your project, what versions you're using and what things you're bringing in. Apart from that, it's also very hard to write the file itself. People libraries, they have to offer this like dep.bzl pattern where they list out their transitive dependencies. And then you need this like often 20-line boilerplate to, bring in the thing first with an HTTP archive and then load a macro from it and then call it and then maybe load another macro from it and then call it again. So that's like a lot of boilerplate for not much clarity. So, this is not really anybody's fault. Just like Yun said, when Bazel was open sourced, we probably wanted to make Bazel work with something like a mono repo, which Google has. And the quickest way to do that is like, okay, I have the source in my workspace. What are all the other things I need? Let's put it in this file. And it seems like a great idea, definitely in the beginning. But in the end, you have this very awkward way of building a mono repo in practice. So there's been like no shortage of user complaints about this. And it's very obvious when you try to use it like in any capacity, really. So that's kind of the background, how we set out to fix the situation.
Great. Thanks.
I can imagine that like there probably has been a lot of security complaints as well, right? So if you can't control something, you can't really predict if it's secure enough.
Yeah, well, the good thing, sort of quote unquote good thing about the workspace files is it's very, very flexible, very, overly expressive. So like it's essentially a programming language. You can do anything with it. So like a certain project, for example, Envoy, they have their own sheet of dependencies within their project. They programmed all over it, and then they have their own security manifest. So for each dependency they're bringing in, they have the CVE identifiers and everything. So like you can do a lot of homegrown stuff with this workspace setup, but obviously it's not conducive to modularization. Like other people can make use of it. So there's a lot of in-house solutions. Like some companies, they have their own in-house solution. We previously talked with Wix, right? They used Maven. Yeah, they essentially wrote their own like dependency management system using the workspace primitives. Yeah, like you said, security is one of the potential problems.
Yeah, as a Bazel user myself, of course, I can relate to the pain that some folks are having here. We actually internally have a system that also kind of generates a lot of that stuff for us, so we don't have to actually write the workspace file. So, yeah, we're looking forward to moving to the Bzlmod for all of our projects as well. Great. Well, that's awesome.
Yeah, I just wanted to ask, you mentioned that there basically were a lot of complaints and stuff. I'm curious, when was this moment when you actually decided to venture into the like journey of like rewriting the whole thing for Bazel?
This has been a long pain point for Bazel users for a long time, and there are several tries to ease the pain. For example, the Bazel Federation, but it turned out it's not working very well. And at the end, we decided, okay, maybe we should just rethink how the external dependency should work in Bazel. And we know workspace is very hard to improve if we just keep working on the same based on the same mechanism. So yeah, that's the time we realized we have to change this. And one background is that more and more build rules are contributed by the community, which is written in Starlark. It has common dependencies, or they sometimes even depend on each other. And native rules are also Starlarkified as Starlark rules. So those are all going to be introduced as external dependencies. And if we don't have a very good, reasonable external dependency management system, it's going to be very painful for Bazel users.
Yeah. So like Yun said, there have been prior attempts at this. Most of them were not rewrite attempts. Like the Bazel Federation is basically, it's like a repo that promises compatibility. Like, okay, these things, they all work with each other at this version that we specified. So just pick and choose whatever you want from this federation thing. But that's not a complete solution to the problem because first of all, it doesn't cover everything. Like it just covers whatever the federation contains. And second, still because of the imperative nature of workspace, there's still a lot of boilerplate involved, and you still cannot do like any sort of dependency resolution. You can only do whatever the federation says you have to do, and then you still have to do the awkward HTTP archive to bring in the archive first, and then load a macro from it, and then call the macro, and maybe you need to load some more. So like it's still the awkward dance of doing this. So without some sort of like overarching change to make the whole thing somewhat more, declarative, that we can collect all the information we need and then do something instead of, load something from remote and then execute some logic, some like cloudy, nebulous logic, and then load some more archives. We just like load all the things, information at once, and then do some like, whatever bespoke logic we want to run. So I guess there was not a sudden point at which we decided, okay, we're going to rewrite it. It's like based on a lot of previous failures and attempts.
And to be fair, we're not throwing everything away. Like repository rule is still supported in Bzlmod because people already have written many useful tools like rules JVM external with repository rule, but they don't work well in a transitive way. If a project A and B both uses rules JVM external and A depends on B, then in A's workspace file, you have to list also B's dependencies, rules JVM external. Yeah, those can actually be improved in Bzlmod. So yeah, maybe we could talk about that more in detail later.
Cool. Yeah. So with all that in mind, it's probably a pretty good natural segue into how you would go about designing the ideal module system, given all the shortcomings of the workspace files that we've covered. So maybe do you want to walk us through kind of what the design process looked like and how you started to formulate some of that stuff and maybe the community input and all that as well?
Yeah, maybe sell us Bzlmod, like what are actual features, why we all need to throw away our like beautiful workspace files.
You want to go or?
Yeah, I can start.
Okay.
I think it was about 1.5 years ago or 2 years ago that we started working on this design doc for a new external dependency system for Bazel. Basically, there are, I think, 2 or 3 major questions that we have to answer. First is what's the dependency resolution algorithm should be. There are a lot of dependency resolution algorithms out there. We checked Maven, I think also definitely Go. And then we decided that we want something simple and reproducible. So that happens to be Go's minimal version selection algorithm. Yeah, and it looks like the Go community is also in favor of this. So that's what we decided to use. And another big topic is, should we have a Bazel central registry to host all Bazel modules? Because for Go module, they actually don't have this. Everything is fetched from GitHub. GitHub is basically the registry. And every project have tagged their versions. And so the Go module can figure out what's available there. But for Bazel, it's quite different, right? Not every project is host GitHub. And we are also not only supporting one language. So we actually send out a survey, a Google form, to ask our users what do they like, what's the problem are they facing, and is Bazel Central Registry going to solve it? And yes, there are a lot of details here. So, but in the end, we concluded that yes, we should have this one because it provides a lot of information that we can later use to build a more integrated ecosystem. Yeah. So, for example, we can implement some tests, pre-submit test for all the Bazel modules that checked in to verify their integrity. And we can also test a different Bazel version with specific Bazel module to figure out the compatibility. And with the dependency graph, we can even test if one new version of a certain module will break its dependent. Yeah, so I think all of these are going to be very helpful. Another thing is that for many C++ projects, people have to manually write build files for them. For example, TensorFlow, if you check their source code, they checked in a lot of build file in their third-party directory to make the C++ projects that they depend on work. And but what if another project which have the same, for example, same dependency zlib, and they write the same build file, write a different build file, and then they could conflict with each other. And with the central registry, we can unify this. We can check in the build file in the central registry, so everybody uses the same. So this reduces a lot of frictions in the ecosystem as well. Yeah. So Another big part is that what we do is with repository rules, and that comes module extension. I think Xudong can elaborate more on that.
Yeah. So yeah, this was only one of the very many questions that we considered when we started the design process. Well, I guess we can continue on this theme first. So module extensions, yeah. So there, like you mentioned before, there are existing rules that deal with sort of source management, like importing packages from other package managers and stuff. The most notable of which is rules JVM external, which brings in Java artifacts from Maven. So yeah, there was a problem of like, okay, how do we continue to allow this? One of the ideas was, okay, we could maybe just like make every single artifact a Bazel module, just like put them in our central registry and be done with it. That would involve a lot of like, migration work because like, I don't know, there's like thousands of, or maybe millions, I have no idea how many artifacts in Maven. And it will be quite a lot of work. So then there was the consideration, okay, maybe we can have an automatic importer of sorts that converts Maven artifacts into Bazel modules and do the same for, Node.js stuff in NPM and like Rust stuff in Cargo and stuff like that. So in the end, we did some, a lot of discussion, and the end result we decided was that this thing is not very easily achievable. Because first of all, each existing package manager has their own nuances and different ways of resolving stuff. For example, NPM allows multiple versions of the same dependency to coexist, just because JavaScript just works like that, and it's completely fine for them. Whereas for Maven, you would always pick one, and Maven picks it with every dependency specification is a range, and you pick essentially something that satisfies all the ranges. And if nothing satisfies it, and then it throws an error or something. But like Go, in contrast, is just like it just picks the newest version that you specified. Like doesn't matter what's available, what the actual newest version is. It just selects the highest version that you specified. So like everything works kind of differently, and it's not completely obvious how we do the conversion from each different package manager to a Bazel module. And there's also the fact that there's rules existing in the community that do some part of it. Like if you think about it, rules JVM external, it essentially brings in Java artifacts, like a request for certain Maven artifacts and turns it into repos. So that's essentially what we want. And someone has already done the work for us. So we decided, okay, we can do something, we can kind of just use this and have some sort of extension system to the module system. So like you don't just rely on the native module system to bring in dependencies. You can have extensions sort of to what we called in the beginning module rules, similar to repository rules, like repo rules. Like module rules could allow you to write a rule to somehow bring in something into the module system. And we eventually changed the name to module extension because like a module rule doesn't really create a new module. It just like creates new repos by doing something while the module resolution thing is going on. Yeah, so like that's one of the problems that we talked about. Going back a little bit on the design process. So yeah, like you said, this started like a year and a half ago. We started by just reading a lot of existing literature, sort of. There's a lot about Go, how like the Go system was designed and how they really prioritized reproducibility, which is a big theme in Bazel too. So I think that's also a big part of the reason why we ended up deciding to use MVS, because like, reproducibility, Bazel is big on that. So why not also bring this into the external dependencies problem? And also we read about, how the previous attempts at fixing this problem failed, sort of. There's multiple internal documents on potential replacement designs. And also, like we mentioned before, the, geez, I'm blanking on it. The Federation. Yeah, the Federation.
Bazel Federation.
Yeah, so there were some like, retrospectives on that. So we tried to take into account those. Yeah, and then we did the survey, we did the preliminary doc. We kind of each went off in a direction to write out some potential designs, and then we weighed them. And in the end, we kind of like put everything together to get into this solution that solved most of the needs. Yeah, which is like for Bazel modules, a central registry, and for other package managing systems, use this extension, which I think in the end, everyone was pretty happy with. There were also like other small questions to resolve, like what should the module manifest file format be? Like, should it be a JSON file or should it be like a, like written in the start arc, like build files and yeah, lots of random stuff. Like this is actually still, a lot of it can be found in the original design doc. There's a huge alternatives to consider section.
Yeah. And I think another thing that we spend a lot of time to make a decision is that should we implement Bzlmod in Bazel or as a separate tool? Because Bazel is the code is very complicated already. We initially don't want to add more complexity on that. Xudong actually tried to implement Bzlmod in Go and made a lot of progress on that, but it turns out it doesn't really work. Yeah,
that was already in the implementation sort of phase, let's say. After we had the design doc sort of nailed down, not really nailed down, there were like still hundreds of comments, but it was mostly settled down. So we were like, okay, we got to implement this. As per the original document, Bzlmod was supposed to be a command line tool. Well, hence the name, sort of. It kind of looks like and sounds like a command line tool, which when run would read the module manifest and like produce a workspace file so that, Bazel can consume and then just work. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And this new workspace file would be much, much more watered down. It would have no load statements. Everything would be much flatter. So mostly people would not work with a workspace file. And they would just work with a module file, run Bzlmod, and have it take care of everything before running Bazel. So that was all nice and good. I spent 3-4 months on the Go implementation. Before at some point, we realized we kind of need to. There's a lot of calls back and forth between Bzlmod and Bazel. Like Bazel, Bazel has this really nice functionality that it watches file changes. If the file did not change, when you rebuild things, it just completely gets skipped. So it's cached. And this is kind of, in my opinion, a very central part to why Bazel is nice. It makes everything much faster. Well, the thing is, if you change your module definition or something, you need to remember to run Bzlmod. And then Bzlmod needs to output something for, into workspace. And then Bazel later will try to remember that this thing has been updated. And then Bazel sometimes will need to call back to Bzlmod to say, okay, this file has changed. This file, which is part of the module manifest, has changed. Bzlmod, can you please run so that I can update you can update the workspace file or something I can rewrite. And eventually that turned out to be such a hassle that I realized I had to implement a big part of Bazel in Bzlmod, which is just at that point, why are we bothering with this? Why don't we just make everyone's life easier and just put it in Bazel? So before, the workflow would kind of be you change the module file, the user need to remember to run Bzlmod, and then before running Bazel. If you don't, then you might be using some stale data. And a lot of people had a problem with this. And we were like, yeah, we see that, but there's also a lot of benefit to splitting this out from Bazel, because Bazel is a huge beast. And the part dealing with workspace files is so freaking complicated. A lot of people, before we started working on this, nobody really understood exactly how it worked. So it took us a lot of time to dig into it. So we were like, yes, it would be great if we can just tear this part out of Bazel and just put it into a separate tool, so that it can be shipped separately. It can be maintained separately. But in the end, it cannot really be shipped separately, because then there will be a version drift, and the interface between Bzlmod and Bazel will kind of slowly drift apart, and that would be a usability concern. And then also being maintained separately is good, but then it adds to the user's burden, basically. You need to remember to call this. You need to remember to run this. You need to remember to do a lot of things. So in the end, we kind of we sent out a doc saying, what would the community think? And pretty much everyone was like, yeah, I guess if we need to implement so much in Bzlmod to make it work, might as well just merge it back into Bazel. So yeah, I guess the point is that it's a very, very iterative process. Nothing was really set in stone. We tore down a lot of our initial assumptions. Hence why it's been going on for 1.5 years and we only have an experimental version to show. I guess we gotta speed it up. But yeah, that's kind of the background of it.
Great. Yeah, that's awesome. Yeah, very cool to hear some of the inner workings of the Bazel team on this stuff. That's cool. Yeah, so obviously in Bazel 5, we got to preview this feature. So I'm kind of curious what potential release timeline looks like for when this might be flipped on by default. Do you have any predictions when that might be? Maybe what version or what year that might occur in?
Yeah, what year? So like our preliminary plan is that 6.0, the next LTS release, will have sort of an official launch of Bzlmod. Like it's not going to be an experimental flag anymore. It's just going to be a flag, and it's still not going to be turned on because we're missing a lot of features. If you go on like the issue tracker on GitHub and just search for area Bzlmod, you can see there's like tons of P1s still to be taken care of. And a lot of it was already planned in our original design doc, like, a log file, a offline mode, a vendoring mode, stuff like that. And also tons of bugs because it's still an experimental version in 5.0. So 6.0 is when we expect sort of an official release so that APIs can be more stable and people can be more confident in trying to migrate. After that, there's still quite a lot of stuff to do, like migration work, tooling. So yeah, we're probably not going to be super soon before we turn it on by default.
Yeah. But I also want to encourage people to try out this feature, even though it's not officially a stable feature. Basically, we're already seeing some early adopters of Bzlmod, and they are already filing back, giving very useful feedback, like finding features in GitHub projects, which will help us understand what use cases are we missing and what do we need to fix. Yeah, so in the meantime, like Xudong said, there are upcoming features planned for Bzlmod we want to implement, and I guess that already also needs some time to iterate and make things work well. Yeah, so I guess 6.0, I guess we can have a first stable version, but it will still keep evolving on that. Yeah, and also the other part is the Bazel Central Registry. It's also in a very early stage. So we're discussing how policies, how do we maintain all those Bazel modules and how do we test them? So there are also some work on this side to make Bzlmod work well, because if you don't have all the modules available, it's not going to work, right?
So before 6.0, I believe we have some milestones we want to. So first, like on my side, working with Simon Stewart, the maintainer of Rules JVM External, to have a Rules JVM External module extension ready so that people who need things from Maven can use that. And then on Yun's side, also we want to make sure that some of the big projects of Google's own can use Bzlmod. Essentially ensure that Bzlmod can satisfy their needs. So the big thing is TensorFlow. So TensorFlow is a big user of Bazel and has I shouldn't say that, a crap ton of external dependencies. So that's going to be, fun. Trying to make work with Bzlmod.
Yeah, I had some working experience with engagement with TensorFlow before, because when I first joined Bazel, I was working on Bazel on Windows, and TensorFlow is basically our goal that we want to achieve to make it build on Windows. Grail. Yeah, and you can say if it works for TensorFlow, it should work for other projects as well, right? So at that time, I also understand their dependencies quite complicated. So if Bzlmod can work for TensorFlow, it could also work for other projects. So
Actually, I want to drill in on that a little bit. This is a bit of a rabbit hole maybe, but when it comes to the supporting dependency system like TensorFlow has, which is basically just a bunch of build files at HTTP repositories, as far as I understand. The question that I have is, obviously we mentioned vendor mode is like a future roadmap item. Yeah. I guess in the short term, like for something like TensorFlow, like how, what does it look like trying to make Bzlmod actually work for those use cases where you've got like just a ton of, external stuff, whether you're pulling it down off the network or you vendored it, and then you've got to produce all these build files. Like, how does that work today with Bzlmod?
Sorry. Do I understand the question is that how?
Well, yeah. So I'll try to restate it. So say the TensorFlow project today wanted to switch to using Bzlmod, but they're stuck with like today they have like all these legacy other C++ dependencies that they're pulling in, and they've got their own handwritten build files. Yeah. So how do they make that work with Bzlmod? Because
I see.
Like specifically we've run into some challenges where we stand up our own registry, but then we've got to like hand write like all these patches to set up all the build files, right? So how does that look like?
I think there are two approaches. The one is that you turn all those dependencies into Bazel modules, because in a Bazel registry you can actually have patches to add build files. And if you add checking all those build files in the Bazel central registry, other projects can also benefit from it. For example, if some project depend on TensorFlow and also depends on that specific C++ dependency, and then they can share the same build file and there's no conflict. I think that's a benefit, but it does require more maintenance work. Like every time you update a version, you have to first upload a new version in the registry, and then you bump the version in the module.bazel file, TensorFlow. Yeah. Another way is that if you look at the TensorFlow's workspace.bzl file, the HTTP archive are also repository rules, right? And module extension can also invoke repository rules. So in fact, you can actually already reuse the exact definitions in the module extension. And this module extension only provides dependencies for TensorFlow itself. If other downstream projects don't know this, it's invisible for them. But so it should just work if you use module extension. But then the downside is, like I said, the downstream projects, if they share the same dependency, they cannot see them, or basically dependency resolution don't work for those dependencies. Yeah, I guess I will. And let's say what the TensorFlow team thinks. Is it worth for them to maintain all those dependencies as Bazel modules, or just keep introducing them as module extension? That could also be an option. Yeah.
Yeah, well, that makes sense. I mean, I think TensorFlow is more of a leaf node probably. So yeah, it makes sense. Like people probably don't need to get all of its transitive dependencies, through some module. So in their case, yeah, like since it's sort of the end of the tree there, makes sense maybe to just keep using the old approach. So that's definitely some good info, I think, for people that are trying to start adopting this stuff now. And yeah, your point of I do like the idea of like contributing upstream. Like if you bother to write a build file for Boost or whatever, contribute it back, and it's cool that there's maybe some room for community contribution on that stuff. So that's definitely cool. Obviously, you mentioned tooling, which maybe we'll dive a little deeper in that later. But obviously, the more tooling there is, the easier it is for individuals to contribute this stuff back upstream. So I'm sure we'll dive a little deeper into that. But sorry, so I want to get back into.
No, that's fine. I think there's one point to mention there about contributing back upstream. If you have like build file patches, you don't actually need to contribute upstream to like the Boost project itself. Like sometimes they don't care. Like they don't care. Like you're using Bazel. Why are you adding all these build files to my tree? So what you meant was that you can, because the Bazel central registry, the way you specify where a module comes from is just like a source archive. And you can also specify a list of patches, which are hosted on the registry itself. Like the registry doesn't host any source archives, but it does host the source patches you want. So like by contributing upstream, you really mean like submitting PRs against the Bazel central registry. So even if the original project does not want Bazel patches, or maybe it's already dead, like it's not even on Git, maybe, you can still very easily put patches in the central registry. Obviously, you still need to maintain the patches and stuff, but like at least it's something that everyone in Bazel will want. So yeah, that's just an addendum.
Thanks.
Right. Yeah, that's great. Yeah. So what about some of the other roadmap items and P1s? So obviously rules JVM external support, critical. Yeah. What about something for NPM and Yarn? Is that something that's on the agenda at all?
Right. Well, I mean, eventually it has to be. It's just like there's so many rules that, touch other dependency management systems that we had to start with one. And rules JVM external happens to be the most used one. But eventually, yeah, we'll definitely need to touch rules. I don't know. Is it rules JavaScript or rules Node.js? I can't remember.
Rules Node.js.
Rules Node.js, yeah. So Alex Eagle, probably, we have been in contact, but he hasn't been doing much with Bzlmod, I don't think. But yeah, eventually that'll be the thing.
Alex already wrote a blog post about adopting Bazel's new package manager, which is awesome.
Oh, did he? Oh,
yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So, well, in that vein, Simon Stewart also wrote a really nice blog post about using Bzlmod, and yeah, it opens our eyes too. As in, like we've been like neck deep in this for like months. So it's kind of sometimes it's hard to see some of the things. Because like we work with it every day, it's obvious to us, but might not be obvious to users or like rule authors trying to use the new system. So this kind of feedback is really important.
Yeah, yeah. I also want to mention that some engineer working on Apple rules or already trying to migrating like Apple support or maybe eventually rules Apple. I think Keith Smiley is also working on that. Yeah. So, but I think more importantly that maybe we should, or the community can also write some best practice and the common issues or pitfalls you encountered when migrating your project to Bzlmod, and share this knowledge with each other so we can accelerate this process. Yeah, we are only a 2-person team, so we cannot take care of all the rules out there. Yeah. So
yeah. On that note, we did create that in the Bazel.
Oh yes, thanks.
We started that thread.
Definitely.
So yeah, hopefully people can go find that discussion, and yeah, hopefully that maybe that can become a good place to sort of centralize some of the knowledge here. I know it looked like Rules 4 and CC did manage to adopt the Bzlmod, so I'm sure there's probably some feedback from that, but it looks like there's some good stuff in their source tree already. So it's coming together. Cool. So before we move on, are there any other like big upcoming features at the top of your mind that you would like to get implemented before we see like a more stable official release here?
Right. So one of the things is the log file, which allows, so because like the version resolution algorithm that we use for Bazel modules, which is minimal version selection, is it's reproducible. Like as long as you don't change any of the inputs, it's always stable. So it doesn't really need a log file. But that changes for module extensions. So like for example, rules JVM external, it calls into Maven. And Maven version resolution is not reproducible. Like it's unstable. So like every time you run it, if there's some remote changes, then you might get different results. So like rules JVM external has its own log file sort of system. It's called Penn Maven install, which outputs like a JSON file that you'd need to check into your source repo. So this is a need that a lot of rules will have. So like a rules Haskell has its own like way of snapshotting using a snapshot. And then if you eventually look at like Cargo for Rust and stuff, which also has a non-deterministic version selection algorithm, then yeah, it's a need that multiple rules will have. So we wanted to solve it like at the root level. Like so essentially when you run a module extension, the result of running that module extension is a list of repos that this module extension will produce. So what we will do is we will store this output, this list of repos and their definitions, and store some sort of checksum for all the inputs into the extensions. Which means that this whole pinning thing, like it's no longer done sort of in-house for each rule. And so there will be one, unified way to do locking sort of pinning. So that's been a big, I guess, feature request. And that's one of the big things I'm going to focus on next.
Another one is about the dependency graph, right? To understand why you depend on specific dependency. I think we already have similar function on the build level with Bazel query and Bazel C query. We also want to implement something for the external dependencies to help you understand why do I actually depend on module A on version X. So it will be helpful for the users, I think.
Yeah, we're actually getting an intern to work on this.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's good.
And one potential feature is that caching, because currently we have some sort of caching for remote repository. When you want to download the HTTP archive, it's cached on your disk. And when you try to download from the same URL, then you don't have to access the internet again. But that's not the final result of an external repository, because you have to extract the archive and probably make some patch and execute some random command to change the content. And this also can take a significant amount of time. For example, especially on Windows, where file operations are quite slow. So we also want to implement some kind of caching for the end result of external repositories. So if nothing changes, you can just get your external repository already prepared. So that could reduce the loading time. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's an excellent feature. That actually, I had one of my later questions is related to this. Maybe we'll just jump into it now. So obviously, an external contributor who we actually talked to on this podcast implemented the remote downloader capabilities, which is
John
obviously the asset API that basically allows a remote cache to fetch the actual dependencies from the net and then cache them. And so any HTTP archives, for example, are actually downloaded by your remote cache infrastructure and cached for you there. So I'm kind of curious what the expectation would be for if this is going to work kind of at all with the remote downloader. So is that something that you've thought at all about, or not so much? So
to be honest, I'm not quite familiar with the remote downloader. I think it's
the gRPC thing that, like when you download something, instead of actually going to the HTTP thing, it just asks this gRPC service, hey, where is it? Or
But that's mostly still for downloading a file or a source archive, right?
Yeah. Those are the only two things that work. So it doesn't support like Git or whatever. It only does HTTP.
Yeah. I mean, that covers a lot of the use cases already. But yeah, I think that was discussed in the early days of the design, and we didn't really have time to work on it. Also, it can keep working, like it is. The downloading part, the fetching over HTTP, or the caching of the fetching of the fetch of HTTP is sort of orthogonal as to deciding what to fetch and deciding what to use, which is more what Bzlmod is about.
Caching on a different level.
Right. Yeah, that makes sense. So under the hood, obviously, I guess at the end, it's going to resolve to HTTP archives. Is that a safe assumption?
Yeah, I mean, that. And what it really falls into is, the repository context objects download method. So anything that goes through that will always go through, the remote downloader config or remoter. There's multiple kind of protocols over this. Like you mentioned, there's this gRPC service, and then also from Apple Simon's side, there's this URL rewriter thing. So everyone just uses their favorite way to deal with this problem, and then we end up with 10 experimental flags. It would be nice one day to consolidate them, but we got our hands full. It was on our radar for a while, but it has kind of fallen behind on the priority queue. But gotcha. Suffice it to say, it would eventually fall into our purview, which is external dependencies, really, anything about there. Yeah, kind of in the backlog.
Cool. Well, I know who to come find when my customers start complaining.
I just want to mention one related feature for the BCR is that we automatically mirror all the source archive in a GCS bucket. So basically, even if the content of the original URL changes, you can still get reproducible build. Yeah, so that's basically, you don't have to write all those duplicated URLs like a mirror.bazel.build and then your original URL. It all happens automatically. So I think it would improve the user experience as well. Yeah.
No, that's great. I was going to ask about that randomly. It seems like a good idea to mirror stuff. That's cool. Glad you're way ahead of me on that one. Awesome. Yeah. So great. So if I'm an end user of Bzlmod, what does it look like if I want to get started with this? So maybe let's walk through two different use cases. We've got rules authors, which is probably a lot more complicated, but probably more important. And then after that, sort of the end users, right? So maybe walk me through as much as you can. Like if I'm a rules author, I've got a fairly simple rule set, but I depend on a few other rules maybe. How do I get started today moving from traditional workspace file and the macro approach to something with Bzlmod?
Yeah, so most of the time it should be very straightforward, really. Because if what you're doing is just like to pull a dependency on A, you just like copy pasted a 20-line snippet from A into your workspace file. Then all you need to do really is replace that 20-line snippet with a simple Bazel depth statement in your module.bazel file saying, okay, I want A at a certain version. And that's all you need to do. There's no URLs, there's no like setup code. It's all like, it all happens automatically because like A's further dependencies will be pulled in automatically. If you need to use anything like any repository rules from that repo, for example, if it's rules JVM external, then you need to think about, okay, well, you need to look at the new module extension API and see how you can call those extensions. Like before, you would just like directly call a repo rule in your workspace file. Now you will need to specify some module extension tags, like some pieces of information for it to process and give you those repos. Yeah, that's the gist of it. But like Yun has a lot of experience. Like Yun even converted Bazel itself to use Bzlmod. So
yeah, so from my experience, is the first step is definitely to understand your dependency graph, right? What are your direct dependencies? What are your transitive dependencies? And then the most important is the direct dependencies, because in the module.bazel file, you actually only need, and you have to list all your direct dependencies, because now we introduce strict depths. So basically you can only see the direct dependencies you define in module.bazel file. Even if another project is your transitive dependencies, you cannot depend on the targets in your build file. So yeah, so once you know what your direct dependencies are, you should check if it's already in the Bazel Central Registry. Then if it is, then great. You just add Bazel depth, module name, and version. And all its transitive dependencies should be fetched automatically. So you don't have to write loads, depths, and you cannot do that in module.bazel, of course. And if it's not, think about should it be a Bazel module. If it should, then you're probably working on helping modernize that project. And it will also benefit other Bazel users when they are doing the migration, right? Yeah. And then if there are still dependencies that you think, okay, maybe it's just my internal dependencies, it doesn't make sense to be a Bazel module. And in that case, it's probably introduced by some of your custom repository rule. And then it's exactly the case Xudong mentioned about. You have to check the module extension API and figure out how to introduce those dependencies with module extension. So I think the process at the beginning, it will be a little bit painful, not painful, but because we already have many of the basic rules available in the registry. But the more projects adopting to Bzlmod, the easier for the following up projects to adopt. So yeah.
It's kind of a rolling snowball. Once we achieve sort of a certain critical mass, then it should be like very straightforward. And like it's often the case that like a 100-line workspace file just gets turned into a 5-line module.bazel file.
Right. Yeah. So, well, let's not gloss over. So if I'm a rules author, though, there's a little bit of extra work, right? Or even if I'm converting something to Bzlmod that wasn't one of my direct dependencies as an end user, I still need to get that back into the central registry somehow, right? So maybe let's walk through what that process would look like, right?
Yeah. So putting a module into the central registry. There's a handy little script that Yun wrote for for putting modules in the central registry. Essentially, you just input some metadata. Like it's an interactive little Python script. You enter some metadata and it calculates all the files that you need in the registry for you. For example, you need like the source archive, you need the checksums for it, and this script will just calculate everything for you. Well, you can go into a bit more detail.
Yeah. So source.json file is the main part. Basically, the most important information is where is your source, right? The URL or your source, and probably some strip prefix that you have we have to strip. Like when you are using HTTP archive, you also have this attribute. And if you want to make some patch, for example, adding some build files. Then you can also specify some patches. The little script can also actually generate some patches for adding build file for you, and also the checksum. Yeah, source.json file is a big part. And another is the module.bazel file. So we store the module.bazel file separately in the central registry so that when we do the dependency resolution, we don't have to download all the source archive and unpack them, which could be time consuming. Yeah, so that currently you have to manually specify a path to it. And in future, I think we could improve the rule to automatically extract this from the source archive. Yeah, another part is presubmit.yaml file. Like I said, we want to test those Bazel modules before we check them in. So this presubmit.yaml file will specify the build targets that you want to expose to your downstream users. And also, you can also specify a few tests that to verify the basic functionalities and or the APIs that you want to expose to make sure them actually work. Yeah, you can also specify different platform, Linux, macOS, Windows, and make sure they work on all those platforms. Yeah, so this is used for presubmit. And in the future, we could also use this to test compatibility with Bazel, or even to test to run downstream tests. Like I said, if you have one newer version, for example, root CC, you probably want to know if this version will break other modules who depend on previous versions. Yeah, so there's some infrastructure we need to implement on Bazel CI to support this. Yeah, but this is also quite important that you specify a list of good tests that won't take a long time to run, but will probably catch, for example, 80% of the common errors. I think it overall will benefit the ecosystem. And I remember I also had a discussion with Fabian and Alex Eagle on how should we test the modules. At the beginning, I just think, okay, you can list a list of targets that probably you already run on your own CI. That works, but in the end, we don't want to encourage people to list their full test suite in the Bazel central registry, because this is not a CI for you. And running all those tests could be costing a lot of resources on CI, and it could take a long time. And more importantly, the internal test isn't really important for here. So we think that maybe people can have a test module in the source archive in some subdirectory, which could depend on the target module. That's the module you want to check in. And this has several benefits. First, you can actually test your target module as an external dependency instead of running the regular test suite as a root project, right? And the second, that you can, of course, the test suite is smaller and it's faster to run. And for example, if you contain the most common use cases of your rule or your simple integration test, that you can cover your basic APIs. So that would be nice. And the third is that when running the tests, that you sometimes actually want to have some dev dependencies. Basically, if you want to introduce more dependencies for testing, it could probably pollute the dependency graph, because your downstream project may get some dependencies they actually don't need. Having a test module that will enable you to exclude those dev dependencies from the target module and make the dependency graph smaller and more accurate. Yeah,
that sounds like an awesome pattern. And I'm not going to name any names, but definitely I've seen rule sets struggle with they only are using local repository override stuff to reference the rules, because the examples and tests are in the same project and their tests pass, but then downstream they fail. So right. We've seen some issues like that definitely in the past. So yeah, the idea of a test module sounds pretty cool. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Great. Are there any other like big blockers you see that might, cause you not to flip or at least remove the experimental prefix from this flag? What are the looming dangers that keep you up at night for rolling this out?
Ooh, it's a big one.
Sounds like
I can talk the thing that keeps me uncomfortable. So basically, since we are introducing external repository transitively, right? And then there's a question that's how do we avoid conflict on the repo names? Because maybe you have an external repository name foo, and your dependency also want to have a repo name foo, but maybe they could point to different versions or even completely different things. So to solve that, we are basically heavily adopting repository mappings. It's a feature that exists a long time, even in workspace file, but it's not extensively used by Bazel users. And so basically, currently in Bzlmod, there are two concepts of repository name. The first is a local repository name, which is basically the repository name you see from your own project. For example, in your build file, you have to depend on, for example, rootcc. Then you can just write at rootcc / some target. But in fact, when we are preparing the directory for rootcc, we are actually, to avoid conflict, we are actually using its canonical repository name, which is the module name dot the version. So basically, it will actually be rootcc dot, for example, 1.0 in your disk. And then there comes a question that what if at runtime you have to access the files from some of your external dependency? Then because of repository mapping, in the past, you will have to include the version number there using the canonical repository name. And this is obviously going to change if the dependency resolution changes. For example, if you upgrade rootcc to a newer version, and suddenly this path changes. And this has been causing a lot of several issues. One of them is that the start doc currently doesn't work, because start doc, it will also load Bazel files, but it's not aware of repository mapping at all. So yeah, we're still trying to figure out how to make this work. If this is going to cause a lot of pain, can we work around this case by case, or should we provide a general solution? Yeah, I think that's
the repo
problem.
name thing is a frequent source of headache.
Yes,
like it's been in Bazel, and it's kind of like what we based the repo renaming and the strict depths features on. But the thing is, the support has been so poor. It's extremely buggy. We already fixed a lot of bugs, but there's still like a few pop up every now and then. Like, for example, just today, someone was saying, if I specify a label in the command line flag, and that label has a repo part like at ABC, then that at ABC today needs to be the absolute, like the canonical repo name, which is supposed to be a secret, like it's a mangled name. Like, obviously, if you're familiar with C++, it's not like you would ever call a symbol by saying, underscore 5C, something, just because it's like an overloaded method. So, yeah, so that's also something we need to fix. And it's also not very straightforward to fix because, you only get the repo mapping after certain things happen. So, like, you can only process this argument after some things have already been done. Yeah, so a lot of this is like very not exciting. It's not like, this is a big feature we're working on, and that's the next thing that's blocking, official release. It's a lot of this like age-old stuff that's broken in Bazel and nobody has looked at, and very arcane stuff you need to fix. So yeah, that's not very exciting to talk about, but it is indeed one of the big headaches. So yeah. I quite worry about usability. Like we don't have the tooling yet, and usability and documentation. It's not that easy to like write a lot of this stuff, but people definitely need it for good reason. If you feel like sometimes it just feels like we're very shorthanded, but we might get a new hire for the team hopefully soon, and the intern will also help. So yeah, things are looking up at least in that regard.
Yeah. Great. Cool. So what is stopping the rules JVM external support from landing?
So that's a
draft PR.
Yeah, so I asked Simon last time, and he said it was just the internal usages of, I think he said it was just, he wanted to remove the workspace file in rules JVM external itself. So like in order to build rules JVM external, you need to have Bzlmod turned on. And that was like one of the last things he wanted unblocked. Yeah, I mean, like I'm obviously I'm just helping. I'm not the maintainer of rules gem external, so I can only give sort of secondhand information.
Well, we
Simon
definitely
has done a
can.
great job of.
We definitely can just interview him
Yeah, of course. Yeah,
and see what's up.
I would be happy to hear about what he has to say.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so we're still meeting from time to time. Also, I want to like kind of like iron out some of the APIs because I think some of it is still not designed perfectly for the module extensions. Like it's still kind of flavored like the old repo rules. So maybe we can iron that out. And then, yeah, I think that should be soon enough, I think. Maybe by the time 5.1 rolls around, might just be ready.
Great. Yeah, very cool. And so when it comes to the Bazel Central Registry, are there any plans to do something with discoverability there? Maybe some command line tool or even a web UI?
Yeah, I think a web UI sounds like a good idea. If you look at Homebrew or VC package for the C++ dependencies, they all have this kind of web page that's showing you all the available packages. I think that can definitely happen with the Central Registry. Yeah, I think it's a good idea. But like we are still in the early ages, there are still not one page of modules checked in. So it's not super urgent, but it will eventually happen. We will have more modules. And in this web page, we could probably show, like, of course, what versions are available for the certain module and its compatibility with Bazel, right? What Bazel versions can build it. And or information like what platforms it supports, or at least being tested on, right? Yeah.
Maybe it's dependencies.
Maybe.
Oh yeah, for sure.
Of course, for sure.
Yeah.
Yes, that's
cool.
That's true.
Yeah, great. Yeah, that sounds awesome. Just need a few more interns to get that done too.
Yeah, no.
Yeah, too many things, too little time.
All right, cool. Well, we're about out of time here, so let's go ahead and wrap it up. So, in conclusion, if folks want to follow either of you two, do you have Twitter handles that you are actively promoting or anything like that?
Not really.
Okay.
For me, I'm not a heavy social media user. So,
I don't use Twitter much, but we are on Slack, so you can.
Yeah. Actually, I wanted to point out that the last couple questions were like from community. So yeah, I posted like a message, and people actually had a couple questions about Bzlmod. So that's pretty cool. Like the UI question and JVM rules external one. So we do take them. So if I post next time, please put some questions into the forum.
So feel free to go into the Bazel Slack, and there's a channel dedicated to external deps, just like hash external dash deps. So yeah, post a question there. We're fairly active now. We weren't before, but like we're fairly active now. So yeah, it should be easy to reach. Yeah, if you want to get help or like ask about questions, that's certainly the way to go. If it's an issue, feel free to file an issue on the GitHub repo. We'll like triage them pretty frequently. And we also very much welcome pull requests to help us fix, some of the easier to fix, but it just takes us some time. Like we have like issue label called help wanted. So some of the Bzlmod related issues are, they should be fairly easy to fix. So very easy for any potential contributors to Bazel. PR's welcome.
Great. Awesome. So yeah, people should just look for help wanted and the Bzlmod tags to get started on contributions. Yep. Okay, great. All right, guys. Well, thanks a lot. And let's go ahead and wrap it up.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thanks all. Bye.
Bye.
Yeah.
Bye-bye.
Thank you for tuning in to the Flare Build podcast. Please like, subscribe, and tune in again with Zach and Tatiana for the next podcast in the series.